History teaches us a comforting lie. It tells us that war ends with the final cannon shot, the last cavalry charge, the signing of a treaty. It paints a picture of silence descending upon a battlefield, of smoke clearing to reveal a definitive conclusion. Victor and vanquished. An ending. This is perhaps the most profound deception a historian can tell. Because for half of the population in any conquered land, the fall of their city's walls, the death of their king, the surrender of their army was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of one. A far more intimate, far more terrifying war. A war fought not with steel, but with shackles. Not for territory, but for the soul itself. A war where the ultimate defeat was not death, but being forced to live, to forget, and to bear the children of the very men who had slaughtered your world. This is the story of the wives of the defeated warriors of the Ottoman Empire. To understand their fate is to understand the empire itself. The Ottomans were not simply conquerors, they were architects, engineers of a multicultural, multi-religious empire that needed to control vast, often rebellious populations. And in their centuries-long project of empire building, they perfected a weapon more potent and more permanent than any siege cannon or janissary's musket. The capture, enslavement, and assimilation of the wives and daughters of their defeated enemies was not a random byproduct of conquest. It was not the unfortunate, chaotic pillaging that follows a battle. It was a calculated doctrine. A state-sanctioned, meticulously engineered weapon of demographic and psychological warfare, refined over generations into a chillingly efficient system. It was a machine designed for a single, chilling purpose: to ensure that a defeated people did not just lose a war, but ceased to exist altogether. It was a blueprint for cultural annihilation. Over the course of this journey, we will walk through the terrifying architecture of this system. We will follow the fate of these women through each stage of a process designed to systematically dismantle a human being, stripping away everything they were, piece by piece. We will begin in the blood-soaked chaos of the battlefield, where a woman of noble birth was transformed in an instant from a person into a piece of property, a spoil of war known as ghanima. We will stand in the cold commercial calculus of the slave markets, where human lives were inventoried, priced, and sold like livestock. We will then pass through the gilded gates of the Imperial Harem, a place mythologized as a palace of pleasure, but which was in reality a prison of breathtaking psychological cruelty. And finally, we will arrive at the destination reserved for the vast, silent majority, a complete and deliberate erasure from the pages of history. This is the story of how an empire was built, not just on the land it conquered, but on the women it consumed. It is not a tale of random cruelty, but of methodical destruction. To understand this machine, we must begin where it did, with the first turn of the gear, on the very fields where empires died and a new, terrible order was born. The system that would ultimately funnel tens of thousands of women into the heart of the Ottoman Empire began with a deceptively simple legal and religious principle: ghanima, the spoils of war. In the context of Ottoman expansion, this was not merely a soldier's right to plunder. It was a foundational economic and political pillar of the state. Everything within a conquered territory, gold, weapons, livestock, and human beings, was considered a legitimate prize, a divine reward for the victory of the faithful. But the Ottomans, ever the bureaucrats, did not leave this process to chance. They institutionalized it, creating a law known as pençik. The word itself, derived from the Persian for 1/5, is chilling in its administrative neutrality. The pençik law, established in the 14th century under Sultan Murad I, stipulated that 1/5 of all spoils of war belonged directly to the Sultan. This was not a tax levied after the fact. It was a primary claim, an immediate, royal appropriation of the most valuable assets from a captured territory. And in the calculus of conquest, the most valuable assets were often not gold, but people. The law transformed the capture of human beings from a chaotic act of individual greed into a state-mandated, organized harvest for the direct benefit of the throne. Imagine the scene. You are the wife of a Wallachian boyar, a Serbian knez, or a Byzantine archon. You have spent your life in a world of privilege and order, your identity defined by your husband's station and the lineage of your family. Your fortress, once a symbol of unbreachable strength, is now a slaughterhouse. The screams have faded, replaced by the organized clamor of victorious soldiers sorting through the ruins of your life. It is in this moment that the gears of the Penchik machine begin to turn. You are not just a terrified survivor. You are now a line item on an imperial ledger. The Ottoman commanders, the Akinci raiders, are not just looking for rebels to execute. They are looking for assets. And as the wife of a defeated leader, you are a prime asset. Your capture is a strategic objective. Your nobility, once your shield, is now your curse. It marks you as valuable property, destined for the Sultan's 1/5 share. This was a profoundly psychological act of subjugation. The first step in the systematic dismantling of your identity was the public, violent severing of your connection to your past. You would be stripped of your fine clothes, your jewelry, the physical symbols of your status. Your name, a carrier of your lineage and power, would be ignored, soon to be replaced by a Turkish or Persian name chosen by your new masters. You would be separated from your children, who were themselves subject to the Penchik if they were of value. In a matter of hours, you ceased to be a wife, a mother, a noblewoman. You became a Penchik Oglan or Kiz, a fifth child, a nameless unit of human currency belonging to a distant, faceless sultan. The process was brutally efficient. Scribes would accompany the army, cataloging the human spoils. Detailed records were kept. This was not the work of a disorganized mob. It was the cold, bureaucratic process of human acquisition. The women, especially those of high birth, were seen as more than just bodies. They were repositories of culture, language, and, most importantly, prestigious bloodlines that the Ottoman elite sought to absorb and neutralize. Capturing the wife of a defeated Serbian prince was not just about acquiring a slave. It was about symbolically possessing the Serbian nobility itself, severing its future by controlling its means of reproduction. The journey from the smoldering ruins of your home to the collection points behind the front lines was the next stage of this psychological demolition. You would be bound and marched alongside thousands of others, a forced migration of the vanquished. The physical hardship, the hunger, the thirst, the exhaustion, was secondary to the mental torment. Every step took you further from the world you knew, and deeper into a state of absolute powerlessness. Your captors held the power of life and death over you at every moment. Resistance was met with immediate, brutal violence. Compliance was the only path to survival, and compliance itself was a form of psychological erosion, forcing you to accept your new reality as a piece of property. This initial stage of the machine, the battlefield harvest, was designed to achieve one primary goal: to induce a state of shock and terror so profound that it shattered the victim's previous identity. It was a calculated process of dehumanization. Before a woman could be remade into a cog in the imperial machine, a concubine, a servant, a mother to a new generation of Ottomans, she first had to be broken. Her spirit had to be emptied of its past, her will to resist dissolved in a tide of overwhelming trauma. The Penchik law was not just a means of acquiring valuable slaves for the Sultan, it was the first, and perhaps most critical act in the long, horrifying process of cultural and personal annihilation. It was the moment a human being was officially rendered into raw material, ready to be transported, categorized, and ultimately reshaped by the architects of the empire. The journey from the battlefield ended for many at the gates of the empire's great cities: Istanbul, Bursa, Edirne, or the notorious Crimean port of Kaffa, a city known to the world as the mother of slaves. It is here that the second, and in many ways more chilling, stage of the machine was set into motion. If the battlefield was about the violent, chaotic acquisition of human beings, the slave market was about their cold, rational, and commercial classification. This was where the raw material harvested by the Pensic was processed, graded, and distributed with the terrifying logic of a highly organized industry. Forget any romanticized or sanitized image of a bustling Oriental bazaar. The slave markets, or Acer Pazarlara, of the Ottoman Empire were not chaotic back-alley affairs. They were sophisticated commercial hubs, often state-regulated, complete with professional brokers, esirhi, inspectors, and detailed legal frameworks governing the sale of human flesh. Here, the wives of defeated warriors, stripped of their names and dignity, faced their next ordeal: a meticulous and invasive appraisal that would determine their ultimate fate. This was the taxonomy of the damned, a scientific system for pricing human misery. Upon arrival, the women would be sorted. This was the first cut. Age, physical health, and general appearance were the initial criteria. The young and healthy were separated from the older and infirm. But for the women of noble birth, the appraisal went far deeper. It was a humiliating, multi-point inspection designed to maximize their market value. First came the physical examination. They would be forced to stand on auction blocks, often naked or nearly so, while potential buyers, wealthy pashas, high-ranking janissaries, court officials, or the Sultan's own agents, inspected them. Every part of their body was scrutinized. The quality of their skin, the color of their eyes and hair, the straightness of their teeth, the elegance of their posture, all were assigned a value. This was not a leering, lustful gaze. It was the cold, calculating look of a merchant assessing merchandise, an investor evaluating an asset. The humiliation was profound, a public declaration of their reduction to a collection of desirable physical traits. Then came the verification of virginity. For noble women destined for the elite households or the Imperial Harem, virginity was a non-negotiable commodity, a feature that could multiply their price tenfold. This was often verified by older experienced women or even medical inspectors, a deeply traumatic and invasive procedure that served as another brutal reminder of their complete lack of bodily autonomy. Their very biology was now a key performance indicator in a transaction between men. Beyond the physical, there was the assessment of skills and lineage. Could she play a musical instrument? Could she sing or dance? Did she speak multiple languages? Was she literate? These were all value adds. But the ultimate prize was her bloodline. Being the wife or daughter of a defeated Serbian prince, a Hungarian noble, or a Byzantine aristocrat made her a status symbol of the highest order. Owning such a woman was a mark of ultimate victory, a tangible display of the owner's power over his former enemies. The brokers would advertise these women's lineage as a key selling point, turning their noble past into a commercial hook. The very thing that had once given them power and respect was now the primary feature that made them a desirable object to be owned. This entire process was framed within the chillingly detached language of commerce. We have historical records, legal documents, and travelers' accounts that describe these markets in unnerving detail. They speak of price fluctuations based on supply from recent military campaigns, of warranties on the health of a slave, of bills of sale that listed a woman's attributes next to her price as if she were a prize mare. This is the true meaning of the banality of evil, not a monstrous act of passionate hatred, but the calm, bureaucratic process of turning a human soul into a commodity, complete with price tags, quality control, and a robust supply chain. It makes modern human trafficking look amateurish. Today, we talk about supply and demand for oil or grain. Back then, they applied the same cold logic to the wives of the men they had just killed. It is here that the path of these women diverged, dictated by the brutal calculus of the market. The most beautiful, most accomplished, and most nobly born were reserved for the highest echelons of society. They were destined for the Sultan's palace, a fate we will explore in the next stage. Others were purchased by viziers and pashas to become prestigious additions to their own harems. Many were bought by wealthy merchants as status symbols. But what of the rest? The women who were deemed less beautiful, who were older, or who lacked the prized skills or bloodlines. Their fate was often grimmer. They were sold into lives of domestic drudgery, becoming servants in wealthy households where they were subject to the whims of their masters and the jealousy of the household's other women. They could be sold again at any time, their lives a constant cycle of uncertainty and abuse. Many were sold to military officers or even common soldiers, and a significant number, especially those whose spirits had been visibly broken, ended up in the brothels that were a common feature of Ottoman cities. It is at this juncture that we must confront the story of figures like Hurrem Sultan, also known as Roxolana. Originally a Ruthenian Orthodox priest's daughter captured by Crimean raiders, her story of rising from a nameless concubine to become the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent is legendary. It is often cited as a tale of incredible female empowerment, of a slave who conquered an empire. And while her intelligence and political skill are undeniable, to see her story as representative is a dangerous historical fallacy. Her story is not a symbol of hope. It is the exception that proves a terrifying rule. For every one Hurrem Sultan who navigated the treacherous currents of the court to achieve unimaginable power, there were hundreds of thousands of other women whose names we will never know. Women who were appraised, sold, and disappeared into the vast, anonymous machinery of the empire. Hurrem's story is valuable not because it shows what was possible, but because its sheer improbability highlights what was impossible for virtually everyone else. She was the 1-in-a-million winner of a lottery whose price of entry was the complete and utter destruction of one's world. For the rest, the market was not a gateway to opportunity, but a final, definitive judgment. A cold, commercial verdict that sealed their fate and sent them down a path that almost always ended in oblivion. For the small, select fraction of women who were deemed the most beautiful, the most accomplished, and the most nobly born at the slave markets, a unique fate awaited. They were destined for the pinnacle of the Ottoman world, the very heart of imperial power, the Harem-i-Humayun, the Imperial Harem of the Sultan. To the outside world, and even to many within the empire, this was considered the greatest possible fortune for a captive woman. It was a life of unimaginable luxury, surrounded by silks, jewels, and servants, protected from the harsh realities of the outside world. This perception is one of the most enduring and deceptive myths of the Ottoman Empire. In reality, the harem was not a palace of pleasure. It was a prison of breathtaking sophistication, a psychological battlefield where survival depended on a brutal, unending competition, and where the price of failure was often a silent, anonymous death. It was a cage, and the fact that its bars were made of gold made it no less a cage. Upon entering the Topkapi Palace, a woman's final link to her past was severed. Her name was permanently erased, replaced with a Persian name chosen for her, often reflecting a physical attribute, like Nergis, Narcissus, or Lalazar, Tulip Field. She was forced to convert to Islam, a conversion whose sincerity was irrelevant. Its purpose was to legally and spiritually bind her to her new world. She was now, in every sense, a possession of the Sultan. Her education began immediately, but it was not an education for enlightenment. It was a vocational training for a single profession, to please the Sultan and, if she was exceptionally fortunate, to bear his children. She would be taught Turkish, the Quran, court etiquette, music, dance, poetry, and the erotic arts. It was a curriculum designed to transform her from a conquered foreign noblewoman into a perfect imperial concubine, a polished and cultivated instrument of the Sultan's will. The architecture of the harem was the architecture of control. It was a labyrinth of courtyards, chambers, and corridors, physically sealed off from the rest of the palace and the world. No man, apart from the Sultan and the eunuchs who guarded it, could enter. The women lived their entire lives within these walls, many never setting foot outside the palace again. Their world shrank to the confines of these opulent chambers, a world governed by an iron-fisted hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as any military command structure. At the apex of this world was the Valid, Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She was the absolute ruler of the harem, a position of immense power. Her word was law. Beneath her were the Sultan's official wives, Cadans, followed by the favored concubines, Iqbals, and the concubines who had caught the Sultan's eye, Josdes. At the very bottom were the vast majority of the women, the novice concubines known as carriers. A woman's entire existence revolved around climbing this ladder. Every interaction, every relationship was a political calculation. Friendships were dangerous alliances of convenience, and betrayal was a common tool for advancement. The air was thick with intrigue, jealousy, and paranoia. This was a system deliberately designed to pit the women against each other, ensuring that their ambitions were focused inward, on competing for the Sultan's favor, rather than outward, on any thought of rebellion or escape. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a self-policing prison where the inmates were also the guards. The agents of this control were the Kethuda Kaden, the chief female steward, and the eunuchs. The black eunuchs, led by the Kuzlar Aası, chief black eunuch, were the guardians of the harem. They were the Sultan's eyes and ears, enforcing the rules with absolute authority. They were themselves slaves, often captured in Africa and brutally castrated, their own tragic condition making them uniquely suited as jailers, who could never be a sexual threat to the Sultan's women. They controlled all communication with the outside world, monitored the women's every move, and administered punishments. Privacy was a concept that did not exist. A woman was never truly alone, her every word and action subject to scrutiny. For the wife of a defeated warrior, this environment was a unique form of torment. She had come from a world where she held power and status. Here she was nothing, a novice at the bottom of a brutal pecking order. Her noble blood, which had made her a prize, now meant nothing unless it translated into catching the Sultan's attention. The only path to survival, let alone power, was to become the ultimate survivor, to embrace the vicious politics of the harem and play the game better than anyone else. This meant suppressing her grief, her anger, and her memory, and channeling all her energy into a singular goal, ending up in the Sultan's bed. And even that was no guarantee of safety. If a woman was chosen by the Sultan and became pregnant, she entered a new and even more dangerous phase. Giving birth to a daughter offered some status, but giving birth to a son, a potential heir, a Shehzade, was the ultimate prize. It elevated her to the rank of a Caden and gave her immense influence, but it also made her a target. The history of the harem is rife with stories of rival concubines poisoning each other's children, of plotting to discredit a rival who had given birth to a son. The law of fratricide, institutionalized by Mehmed the Conqueror, which allowed a new sultan to execute all of his brothers to prevent civil war, turned the harem into a breeding ground for future bloodshed. The mothers of princes were engaged in a decades-long death match, knowing that on the day the old sultan died, one of their sons would sit on the throne, and the others would likely be strangled with a silk bowstring. For those who broke the rules, punishment was swift and severe. Minor infractions could lead to beatings with rods or confinement in the harem's dungeons. But for the ultimate crime, infidelity or treason, the punishment was one of the most terrifying in the annals of the empire, the sack punishment. The condemned woman, sometimes weighted down with stones, would be sewn alive into a leather sack. In the dead of night, she would be taken by the eunuchs to a boat and rowed out into the dark waters of the Bosphorus Strait. There, she would be thrown overboard, her silent, suffocating death witnessed only by her executioners. It was a method designed to be the ultimate negation of a person. No public execution, no marked grave, just a silent disappearance into the cold, dark water. It was the system's final, brutal way of saying that you had never existed at all. This was the reality of the gilded cage. It was a world where luxury was the backdrop for unrelenting psychological warfare, where beauty was a weapon, and where motherhood was a gamble for the highest stakes imaginable. For the wife of a defeated foreign warrior, this best possible fate was, in truth, the final and most elaborate stage of her destruction. It was a process that did not just take her freedom, but forced her to actively participate in the erasure of her own past, to fight and scheme and betray, all for the chance to survive in a beautiful, glittering hell of the Sultan's own design. The gilded cage of the Imperial Harem, for all its spectacular cruelty, was the fate of a statistically insignificant few. Its story, filled with legendary names and high-stakes drama, has captured the historical imagination for centuries. But in doing so, it has cast a long shadow, obscuring a far larger, more mundane, and ultimately more significant truth. For every one noblewoman selected for the Sultan's palace, there were thousands of others whose journey ended in the anonymous households and back rooms of the empire. It is in their silent, unrecorded fates that we find the true purpose and devastating success of this Ottoman machine of conquest. The vast majority of the wives of defeated warriors, the women who were not of royal blood, who were deemed less beautiful, or who simply had the misfortune of being captured during a campaign that yielded a surplus of human spoils, were sold into the broader society. Their fates were varied, but almost all shared a common destination: oblivion. Many were purchased by wealthy officials, merchants, or military commanders to be domestic servants. Here, they lived a life of thankless drudgery, subject not only to the absolute authority of their male master, but also to the authority and often cruel jealousies of his legal wives. They were the lowest members of the household, with no rights, no protection, and no hope of changing their station. Sexual abuse was a constant and unspoken reality of their existence, an accepted part of their condition as property. Others were taken as secondary wives or concubines by soldiers or minor officials. In this capacity, their primary function was to bear children. This was not a path to status, but a biological imperative imposed upon them. Their sons would not be princes, but they would be Muslims. They would be Ottomans. They would be raised speaking Turkish, practicing Islam, and knowing nothing of their mother's language, her faith, or the culture of the people from whom she was stolen. and a significant number were funneled into the brothels and entertainment houses of the empire's sprawling cities. Here, their life expectancy was brutally short, their existence reduced to the most basic and degrading form of commercial exploitation. They were the final, disposable products of the system, used until their bodies gave out, and then replaced by the next wave of captives from the empire's ever-expanding frontiers. This is where the chilling, strategic genius of the system becomes clear. The ultimate goal was not simply punishment or subjugation, it was erasure. It was a form of cultural and demographic genocide executed one family at a time over centuries. By capturing and absorbing the women of a conquered people, the Ottomans attacked their enemy at the most fundamental level, the family. They severed the generational transfer of culture. A language dies when there are no mothers to teach it to their children. A religion withers when there are no women to pass on its traditions in the home. A people's identity dissolves when its children are raised to be loyal subjects of the very empire that destroyed their fathers. This was a weapon more effective and more permanent than any sword or cannon. An army can be rebuilt. A city can be fortified. But a people whose women have been taken and whose children have been absorbed into the culture of the conqueror is a people set on a course for extinction. The Ottomans understood this with terrifying clarity. By seizing control of the means of reproduction, they ensured that their defeated enemies would not just be ruled, but would, over the course of a few generations, be bred out of existence. The memory of their Serbian, Hungarian, Greek, or Albanian ancestors would become a faint, forgotten whisper, drowned out by the dominant culture of their new masters. This wasn't a tragic byproduct of war. It was a deliberate, state-level strategy of demographic engineering, and it was breathtakingly successful. The history books are filled with the names of the sultans, the grand viziers, and the great battles they won. They are the stories of men. But the silent, invisible foundation upon which much of the empire's stability was built was the story of these women. Their stolen fertility, their suppressed cultures, and their forgotten names were the price of Ottoman expansion. Their fate was not a footnote to the story of conquest. It was the engine of its permanence. So, as we reflect on this history, we are forced to confront its profound silence. We remember the victors because they wrote the chronicles. We have forgotten the vanquished because the machine was designed to make us forget. It was designed to leave no trace, to absorb and dissolve its victims so completely that future generations would not even know they were gone. The lesson in this is not merely about the past. It is a chilling reminder of how empires are truly built and sustained. They are not just political or military entities. They are cultural and biological projects. The most enduring conquests are not of land, but of identity. And so we are left with a vital, pressing question, one that echoes from the silent harems and forgotten households of the past into the conflicts of our own time. As we watch the world today, who is telling the story? And more importantly, whose story is being systematically, silently, and deliberately erased?